Hello, this is Philip Myers of PEMI Consulting. Last week was the API Spring Refining Meeting. Thousands of things are going on, and there's no way to recap it all for you, so I'm just going to pick out a few highlights. First, the business. API 2610, which covers everything about fuel distribution terminals, was up for vote. It did not receive any negatives, so it will be passed to publication soon. For the basic team of standards API 650, 653, and 620, as always, they were discussed and many agenda items resolved, and some of them will be published as changes. There was also work on API 656, which is for the inspection of LNG tanks. We hope to publish in 2028. But the most significant recall I have is about the cosine curve. Hang on, I will tell you about it in just a moment. On Tuesday, we went to lunch outside the Hyatt Hotel near the Embarcadero. The first thing we ran into was this awesome 45-foot-high art statue made of stainless steel mesh. It's called R Evolution, which was installed last month. The ferry building has lots of places for lunch and funky little shops of all kinds. But I don't think these two guys are very happy that they would be going to lunch. A fellow API committee member confided in me that he did not really have a good intuitive feeling for how the cosine curve arises from a tilted tank. So I made this explanation for him, but many of you may find it helpful if you are in the same boat. A cylindrical flat-bottomed tank may sink or tilt without distortion to the bottom or shell. This is called rigid body tilt. Anyway, what does the cosine curve have to do with this? The distortion of the tank bottom away from this tilt plane is what differential settlement is. And here's a plot of the cosine curve. The cosine curve represents the flat perimeter on a tilt plane. Let's get a few points out of the way. The circular tank bottom without a tilt is round, but if I were to tilt it to an extreme amount like 45 degrees, this oval would shrink on its minor diameter to about 70% of the diameter of the white circle. But in the real world, that never happens. Tanks would be considered fairly extreme tilting if they tilted even 1 degree. So from now on, we'll just ignore this negligible error in the calculation versus the theory of what we're talking about. There are two definitions that are kind of important that I'll be using. One of them is the dip plane, which is this plane of maximum tilt. So if you put a drop of oil here, it would run parallel to this dip axis. So that's kind of the maximum slope. On the other hand, the rotation of this tilt plane is through this strike axis. We'll be looking head on at this axis for the analysis coming up next. In math speak, cosine function is an even function, meaning that cosine of, say, 10 degrees is the same as cosine of minus 10 degrees. That's convenient because if we set 0 for the angle here and we're looking at tilt, the tilt at this point, negative 45 degrees, for example, is the same as the tilt at this point, positive 45 degrees. Another simplification is to let r equal to 1. That you can always scale this up to any diameter you want. And this distance from the center of the circle to the point of interest, in other words, this point or this point, how high up they're tilted, this distance is the cosine of theta. And since the elevation of the tilt is proportional to the distance away from the strike line, as shown here, we can say that y is proportional to k, some constant, times the cosine of theta. It's proportional to kx. But we can further define this constant as the tilt divided by 2 times the cosine of theta. Just to check this, say the tilt was 10 inches. That's from the very lowest point, minus 5 inches below the strike line, and to 5 inches above the strike line. 10 divided by 2 is 5 times the cosine of theta. At this point, the cosine of theta is 1, so that would give you 5 inches, which is correct. And here's the best part. The green line is an exaggerated 45-degree tilt, just for illustration, but if you draw these lines down, which represent the elevation above the strike line, which is here, you'll see that these elevations follow this wave pattern. Well, this wouldn't be called a cosine curve, this would be called a sine curve, but the sine is really just the cosine shifted by a phase angle of 90 degrees. If the terms related to sinusoids are a little bit confusing, I have a video on this and I'll leave it in the description. Well, until next time, good talking to you. I hope to talk to you again soon.